Think your emergency food kit is impressive? Vikings were surviving months at sea with nothing but what they could carry in wooden chests over 1,000 years ago. When their food ran out in the middle of the North Atlantic, these Norse warriors didn't panic. They had survival techniques that would make modern preppers look like amateurs. Today, we're discovering 8 Viking survival methods that kept entire crews alive when death seemed certain. Get ready to discover why these ancient seafarers were the ultimate survivors of the medieval world, and how their techniques could save your life today. The Viking pantry, built for the long haul. Before we dive into their emergency tactics, let's understand what Vikings packed for these epic voyages. Their food storage system was like having a medieval MRE depot that could last half a year, but with technology that puts modern freeze-dried meals to shame. Vikings loaded their longships with hardtack, called knekkebrød, dense dry bread that could survive anything short of being thrown overboard. These weren't your grandmother's crackers. They were engineered survival food that could last years without spoiling. The preparation process for knekkebrød was an art form. Viking women would grind barley and oats into flour, mix it with just enough water to form a dough, then roll it paper thin before baking it until it became nearly indestructible. The result was a bread so hard that Vikings had to soak it in water, ale, or even seawater to make it chewable. But here's the genius part. This hardtack was packed with complex carbohydrates and could provide sustained energy for hours of rowing or fighting. They packed barrels of salted fish, particularly cod and herring, using salt preservation techniques that modern food scientists are still studying. The Vikings didn't just throw salt on fish and hope for the best. They developed a precise curing process that involved layering fish with specific types of salt, pressing it under weighted stones, and aging it in specially designed barrels that allowed moisture to escape while preventing contamination. Their dried meat, called turfisk, was another marvel of medieval food technology. Vikings would hang strips of meat in the cold, dry air of Scandinavia until all moisture was removed, creating protein that was more concentrated than modern beef jerky. A single pound of turfisk contained the nutritional equivalent of 3 pounds of fresh meat, and it could last for years without refrigeration. But perhaps most impressive were their fermented dairy products. Vikings created a cheese-like substance called gammelost that was so well preserved it could survive months at sea while actually improving in flavor. They also packed fermented butter that modern food scientists have found contains beneficial bacteria that aided digestion and prevented certain diseases. The genius wasn't just in what they packed, but how they rationed it. Each Viking received precisely measured daily portions, about 1 pound of protein, a handful of grain, and carefully controlled water rations. This wasn't guesswork. It was mathematical survival planning that NASA would admire. Archaeological evidence from a Viking ship found in Norway revealed food stores calculated to feed 30 men for exactly 180 days, with emergency reserves that could extend the voyage another month if necessary. Water storage was equally sophisticated. Vikings used specially treated wooden barrels lined with pine tar that prevented the wood from rotting while keeping the water relatively fresh. They understood that water quality was just as important as quantity, and they developed techniques for purifying questionable water using charcoal filters and boiling methods that killed harmful bacteria centuries before anyone understood germ theory. Method 1. The art of creative rationing. When food stores began dwindling, Vikings didn't just cut portions, they revolutionized how they ate. They developed what we might call survival psychology dining, a system that would make modern behavioral psychologists take notes. Instead of eating 3 disappointing meals that reminded everyone of their desperate situation, they created one daily feast that felt substantial and maintained crew morale. The timing was crucial. Vikings understood something modern dietitians are rediscovering. When you're surviving on limited calories, meal timing can be more important than meal size. They'd fast during daylight hours while working the ship, allowing their bodies to enter a metabolic state that actually increased mental clarity and physical endurance. Then, as the sun set, they'd gather for a communal evening meal that felt like a celebration rather than rationing. This wasn't just about calories. It was about maintaining the social bonds that kept crews from turning on each other when desperation set in. The evening meal became a sacred ritual where stories were shared, plans were discussed, and the crew reinforced their unity. Vikings understood that a hungry crew was dangerous, but a divided crew was deadly. The psychological aspect was brilliant. By treating their meager rations as a feast worth celebrating, Vikings maintained hope and unity even when their situation seemed hopeless. They'd arrange their small portions on wooden plates with the same ceremony they'd use for a victory banquet, complete with toasts and formal presentations of the food. Modern survival experts studying these techniques have found that crews using Viking-style rationing had significantly higher survival rates than those who simply cut portions across the board. The reason? Maintaining morale and social cohesion proved more important for long-term survival than maximizing individual caloric intake. Vikings also developed portion control techniques that maximized the psychological impact of their limited food. They'd cut their hardtack into specific shapes, arrange their dried meat in patterns, and present their fermented dairy products as if they were delicacies. This attention to presentation helped maintain the illusion of abundance, even when supplies were critically low. The most ingenious aspect was their rotation system. Different crew members took turns being responsible for meal preparation and presentation, giving everyone a sense of purpose and control over their situation. This prevented the despair that often set in when people felt completely helpless in survival situations. Method 2. Ocean foraging. Like ancient marine biologists, Vikings turned their longships into floating research vessels, studying every creature the North Atlantic offered with the dedication of modern marine biologists. They weren't just fishing, they were conducting systematic studies of ocean ecosystems that would make contemporary oceanographers proud. When traditional fish became scarce, Vikings knew exactly which seaweeds were edible, which jellyfish could be consumed safely, and how to harvest nutrients from creatures most people would never consider food. Their seaweed knowledge was particularly impressive and scientifically sound. Vikings identified over a dozen varieties of edible sea vegetables, each with specific preparation methods that maximized nutritional value while eliminating potential toxins. They knew that dulse, a red seaweed, was packed with iron and could prevent anemia during long voyages. They harvested kelp for its iodine content, understanding somehow that it prevented certain diseases, though they wouldn't have known the scientific explanation. The preparation techniques were sophisticated. Vikings would wrap fish in certain seaweeds before cooking, accidentally creating preservation methods that modern chefs are rediscovering. The seaweed not only added flavor, but also provided natural preservatives that extended the fish's edible life. One type of red seaweed they called searle was so nutritious that a handful could sustain a warrior for an entire day, providing vitamins, minerals, and complex carbohydrates. Vikings also became experts at identifying and harvesting sea lettuce, a green seaweed that provided vitamin C and helped prevent scurvy. They'd dry it in the sun and store it in leather pouches, creating a portable source of essential nutrients that could be added to any meal. Modern nutritional analysis has shown that properly prepared sea lettuce contains more vitamin C per ounce than citrus fruits. The most remarkable aspect was their systematic approach to ocean foraging. Vikings maintained detailed mental catalogs of what was edible in different seasons and locations. They knew that certain deep water creatures only appeared during specific weather patterns, and they'd adjust their foraging strategies accordingly. This wasn't desperate scavenging. It was sophisticated resource management based on generations of accumulated knowledge. They developed specialized tools for ocean foraging, long-handled nets for scooping floating seaweed, hooks designed specifically for pulling kelp from underwater rocks, and containers that could keep delicate sea vegetables fresh for days. Vikings even created underwater viewing boxes, wooden frames with transparent animal membranes stretched across the bottom, that allowed them to see beneath the surface and identify edible resources growing on the ocean floor. Jellyfish became an unexpected protein source during desperate times. Vikings learned to identify which species were safe to eat and developed preparation methods that neutralized their stinging cells while preserving their nutritional value. They'd boil jellyfish with seaweed and herbs, creating a gelatinous soup that provided protein and essential minerals. Method 3. The Viking Fishing Revolution. When you're 200 miles from the nearest coastline with empty food barrels, Vikings didn't just drop a line and hope for the best. They developed fishing techniques so advanced that modern commercial fishermen still use variations of their methods today. Vikings created multi-level fishing systems with different lines at various depths, maximizing their chances of catching something edible while accounting for the different feeding patterns of various fish species. Their understanding of fish behavior was encyclopedic. Vikings knew that cod preferred deeper, colder waters and would adjust their fishing depths accordingly. They understood that herring traveled in massive schools and developed net techniques specifically designed to capture large quantities when these schools were encountered. They even recognized seasonal migration patterns, timing their voyages to intersect with fish populations at optimal moments. The net technology was revolutionary for its time and incredibly sophisticated. Vikings wove nets from specially treated animal sinew that could handle the massive fish of the North Atlantic without breaking. The sinew was processed using techniques that made it stronger than modern synthetic fishing line, while remaining flexible enough to work in freezing conditions. They created nets over 100 feet long with varying mesh sizes. Smaller mesh near the center to catch small fish, larger mesh at the edges to allow juvenile fish to escape and maintain breeding populations. Vikings developed techniques for fishing while sailing, turning their longships into mobile fishing platforms that could cover vast areas of ocean while maintaining their course. They created dragnets that could be deployed behind the ship, trawling for fish while the crew continued rowing or sailing. This technique allowed them to fish continuously rather than stopping their journey, maximizing both travel time and food acquisition. The preservation aspect was equally impressive and scientifically sound. Vikings could clean, salt, and dry a 50-pound cod in under 2 hours, creating protein that would last months without spoiling. Their technique involved precise cuts that maximized surface area for salt penetration while maintaining the fish's structural integrity. They developed smoking techniques using driftwood and seaweed that created flavors modern gourmet chefs try to replicate, while the smoke provided natural preservatives that prevented bacterial growth. Their fish processing was so efficient that they could handle massive catches without waste. Vikings developed techniques for using every part of the fish: the meat for immediate consumption and preservation, the bones for tools and needles, the swim bladders for waterproofing, and even the scales for decorative purposes. This zero-waste approach was born from necessity, but demonstrated remarkable resourcefulness. Vikings also created specialized fishing equipment for different conditions. They had ice fishing techniques for when their ships became trapped in frozen waters, using bone hooks and sinew lines that remained flexible in sub-zero temperatures. They developed deep-water fishing methods for catching bottom-dwelling fish when surface fish were scarce, using weighted lines and specialized bait that could attract fish from great depths. Method 4. Raiding for survival, not just glory. When food ran critically low, Vikings transformed from explorers into strategic resource acquisition specialists. But these weren't random attacks driven by desperation. They were carefully planned supply missions that required more intelligence gathering than a modern military operation. Vikings maintained networks of informants throughout coastal communities who could provide detailed information about which settlements had the best food stores, when merchant ships loaded with provisions would be passing through specific waters, and which targets would provide maximum resources with minimum resistance. Their intelligence network was surprisingly sophisticated. Vikings would send scouts ahead disguised as traders or pilgrims, gathering information about local food supplies, defensive capabilities, and the best times to strike. These scouts would identify granaries, livestock pens, and food storage facilities, creating detailed mental maps that would guide the actual raids. They even gathered information about local customs and languages, allowing them to blend in and gather intelligence without arousing suspicion. The raiding strategy itself was remarkably sophisticated and showed deep understanding of human psychology. Vikings preferred to take supplies without violence when possible, understanding that dead merchants couldn't provide future resources, and that excessive brutality would lead to increased defenses in the region. They developed a reputation for being fair raiders, taking what they needed for survival while leaving enough for their targets to survive and continue producing resources. This wasn't kindness. It was long-term strategic thinking that ensured future supply opportunities. Vikings understood that sustainable raiding required maintaining a balance between taking enough to survive and leaving enough to ensure their targets remained viable for future raids. Some Viking crews even established informal protection agreements with certain communities, providing security from other raiders in exchange for regular tribute payments of food and supplies. The logistics of these supply raids were impressive and required careful planning. A successful Viking supply raid could yield enough food to feed a 40-man crew for 2 months, but only if they could properly transport and preserve their acquisitions. Vikings developed portable preservation techniques that allowed them to process and store large quantities of food quickly during raids. They carried salt, smoking materials, and preservation equipment specifically for this purpose. Vikings knew exactly how to identify and prioritize targets based on maximum nutritional return. Grain ships from Ireland provided carbohydrates that could sustain crews for months. Livestock vessels from Scotland offered fresh meat that could be immediately consumed or preserved. Fishing boats returning from successful expeditions provided protein that was already partially preserved and ready for long-term storage. One historical account describes a Viking crew that captured 3 merchant vessels in a single week, acquiring enough supplies to extend their voyage by 4 months. The key was their systematic approach. They didn't just take everything they could carry, but specifically targeted foods that would provide maximum nutritional value and storage life for their particular situation. Vikings also developed techniques for rapid food processing during raids. They could butcher livestock, salt meat, and prepare it for transport in remarkably short periods. They created portable smoking setups that could preserve large quantities of meat while the raid was still in progress, maximizing the value of their acquisitions. Method 5. Coastal foraging mastery. Vikings were the ultimate coastal survivalists, able to identify edible resources that most people would walk right past. When they made landfall, whether planned or emergency, Vikings could transform any coastline into a temporary supermarket within hours. Their knowledge of coastal ecosystems was encyclopedic, covering everything from which berries were safe in different seasons to which roots provided the most nutrition and how to process plants that were toxic when raw but nutritious when properly prepared. Their plant identification skills were remarkable and based on generations of accumulated knowledge. Vikings could identify dozens of edible plants by sight, smell, and even taste, knowing exactly when each plant was at peak nutritional value and how to prepare it for maximum benefit. They knew that rose hips were packed with vitamin C and could prevent scurvy, that certain mushrooms provided protein comparable to meat, and that various roots could provide carbohydrates when other food sources were unavailable. The processing techniques were sophisticated and showed deep understanding of plant chemistry. Vikings knew how to leach tannins from acorns to make them edible, how to ferment certain roots to increase their nutritional value, and how to dry and preserve wild vegetables for long-term storage. They developed cooking methods that maximized nutritional extraction while eliminating potential toxins. Their shellfish knowledge was encyclopedic and scientifically accurate. Vikings could identify dozens of edible mollusks, crustaceans, and sea creatures that lived in tidal pools and shallow waters. They knew which shellfish were safe during different seasons, understanding somehow that certain species became toxic during specific times of the year. They developed harvesting techniques that ensured sustainable collection while maximizing their protein intake. Vikings created specialized tools specifically for coastal foraging that demonstrated remarkable ingenuity. They had knives designed for prying shellfish from rocks without damaging the meat, nets for catching small fish in tidal pools, and containers that could keep delicate sea creatures alive and fresh for days. They even developed digging tools for harvesting clams and other burrowing shellfish, understanding the specific techniques needed for different species. The most impressive aspect was their ability to quickly assess any coastline's resources and develop a comprehensive foraging strategy. Within hours of landing, Vikings could identify the best foraging spots, the safest sources of fresh water, and which local plants could supplement their diet. They treated every coastline like a complex puzzle to be solved, with food and resources as the prize for understanding the local ecosystem. Vikings also understood seasonal variations in coastal resources and could predict what would be available at different times of the year. They knew when certain berries would ripen, when shellfish would be at their largest and most nutritious, and when migratory birds would provide additional protein sources. This knowledge allowed them to plan their voyages to take advantage of seasonal abundance. They developed preservation techniques specifically for coastal foraging that allowed them to extend the benefits of their land-based food gathering. Vikings could smoke shellfish, dry berries, and preserve wild vegetables using techniques that maintained nutritional value while creating portable food sources that could sustain them during the next leg of their voyage. Method 6. The science of scurvy prevention. Long before anyone understood vitamin C or the biochemistry of scurvy, Vikings had figured out how to prevent the dreaded seasickness that killed more sailors than storms and battles combined. Their understanding was empirical, but remarkably accurate. They knew exactly which foods prevented the mysterious illness that made teeth fall out, caused old wounds to reopen, and eventually led to death. Vikings developed a sophisticated understanding of which foods prevented scurvy through generations of trial and error, creating what was essentially a medieval medical protocol that modern nutritionists recognize as scientifically sound. They packed specific plants and prepared special drinks that modern analysis has proven were loaded with exactly the nutrients needed to prevent vitamin C deficiency. Their anti-scurvy arsenal was impressive and diverse. Fermented cabbage, essentially an early form of sauerkraut, was a staple on long voyages. Vikings understood that the fermentation process not only preserved the cabbage for months, but actually increased its nutritional value. Modern analysis shows that properly fermented cabbage contains more bioavailable vitamin C than fresh cabbage, plus beneficial bacteria that aided digestion and boosted immune function. Pine needle tea was another crucial weapon against scurvy. Vikings would harvest pine needles from coastal areas and steep them in hot water, creating a drink that tasted like Christmas gone wrong, but contained massive amounts of vitamin C. They knew to use young, bright green needles rather than older, darker ones, somehow understanding that the younger needles contained higher concentrations of the nutrients they needed. Vikings also packed a variety of preserved berries that retained their vitamin content for months. Cloudberries, lingonberries, and bilberries were carefully dried, using techniques that maintained their nutritional value while creating portable sources of essential vitamins. They developed preservation methods that modern food scientists are still studying, involving controlled drying temperatures and specific storage conditions that prevented nutrient loss. The most fascinating discovery is that Vikings created fermented drinks from whatever plant matter they could find during their voyages. These weren't just alcoholic beverages for entertainment. They were carefully crafted health tonics that prevented disease and maintained crew vitality. The fermentation process created beneficial bacteria while preserving vitamin content, essentially creating medieval probiotics. Vikings would raid coastal areas specifically for these health-preserving foods, understanding that a crew's health was more valuable than gold or silver. They developed techniques for quickly identifying and harvesting vitamin-rich plants during brief shore visits, maximizing their health benefits while minimizing time spent away from their ships. Their preparation methods were sophisticated and showed deep understanding of nutrition preservation. Vikings knew that certain cooking methods destroyed the beneficial properties of their anti-scurvy foods, so they developed techniques for preparing these foods that maintained maximum nutritional value. They understood that raw or lightly cooked foods were more effective than heavily processed ones. The most remarkable aspect was their systematic approach to scurvy prevention. Vikings didn't just hope their anti-scurvy foods would work. They carefully monitored their crews for early signs of the disease and adjusted their nutritional strategies accordingly. They recognized that prevention was far more effective than treatment, and they built their entire food system around maintaining crew health rather than just providing calories. Method 7. Psychological survival warfare. Vikings understood that surviving months at sea wasn't just about having enough food. It was about maintaining the mental strength to endure when everything seemed hopeless. They developed psychological techniques that modern military survival training has adopted, creating a comprehensive system for maintaining morale and preventing the mental breakdown that could destroy a crew faster than any storm. Their storytelling tradition served a crucial survival function that went far beyond entertainment. During the longest, hungriest nights, Vikings would take turns sharing sagas and adventures, creating elaborate narratives that distracted from empty stomachs while reinforcing crew bonds and cultural identity. These weren't just stories, they were psychological tools that maintained hope and unity when physical conditions were breaking men down. The stories themselves were carefully chosen for maximum psychological impact. Vikings would tell tales of previous crews who had survived even worse conditions, creating a framework of hope and precedent that made their current situation seem survivable. They shared stories of legendary feasts and abundant harvests, keeping the memory of better times alive when current reality was grim. Vikings also used competitive storytelling as a survival tool. Crew members would compete to tell the most engaging tales, with the winner receiving small extra portions of food or other privileges. This competition served multiple purposes. It provided entertainment, encouraged creativity and mental engagement, and gave crew members something to strive for beyond mere survival. The most effective technique was their approach to shared suffering. Vikings created a culture where enduring hardship together was a source of pride rather than misery. They turned survival itself into a competition, with crews taking pride in their ability to outlast other Viking expeditions. This psychological framework transformed potentially mutinous situations into opportunities for crew bonding and collective achievement. Vikings developed elaborate rituals around mealtimes that served important psychological functions. Even when food was scarce, they maintained formal procedures for food distribution, blessing blessing the meal, and sharing it communally. These rituals provided structure and normalcy in chaotic situations, giving crew members something familiar to anchor their mental state. They also created systems for maintaining individual dignity and purpose during survival situations. Every crew member had specific responsibilities and roles that remained important even when food was scarce. This prevented the sense of helplessness and uselessness that often led to despair and mental breakdown during extended survival situations. Vikings understood the importance of maintaining future-focused thinking during survival situations. They would spend time planning what they would do when they reached their destination, discussing the feasts they would have, and making detailed plans for their return home. This future-focused thinking prevented the despair that came from feeling trapped in an endless cycle of suffering. Method 8. Emergency protein sources. When all conventional food sources were exhausted, Vikings had backup plans that would shock modern sensibilities, but kept them alive when death seemed certain. These weren't desperate measures born of panic. They were systematic approaches to extracting nutrition from unconventional sources, developed through generations of survival experience and passed down as essential knowledge. Vikings knew exactly which parts of their leather equipment could be processed into edible protein. Leather boots, belts, and ship components made from properly treated animal hide could be boiled for hours to extract collagen and other proteins. The process was lengthy, and the results weren't appetizing, but it provided essential amino acids when no other protein sources were available. They developed specific preparation methods that maximized nutritional extraction while making the leather as palatable as possible. Rope processing was another emergency technique that demonstrated remarkable ingenuity. Viking ships used ropes made from plant fibers and animal sinew, both of which could be processed into something resembling food during extreme emergencies. They would unravel the rope, separate the fibers, and boil them extensively to break down the cellulose and extract whatever nutrients were available. While not particularly nutritious, this provided bulk that helped fill empty stomachs and gave the psychological comfort of having something to eat. Vikings also developed techniques for processing and eating various ship components that contained organic materials. Wooden parts of the ship that had been treated with animal fats could be scraped and boiled to extract those fats, providing essential calories and nutrients. Even the tar used to waterproof their ships contained organic compounds that could provide minimal nutrition in extreme situations. Seabird hunting became a crucial survival skill during migration seasons. Vikings created specialized traps and nets that could capture birds without requiring the ship to stop or change course significantly. They understood bird migration patterns and could predict when different species would be flying over their route, positioning themselves to take advantage of these opportunities. The bird processing techniques were comprehensive and waste-free. Vikings used every part of captured birds: the meat for immediate consumption, the fat for cooking and preservation, the bones for tools, and even the feathers for insulation and waterproofing. They developed cooking methods that maximized the nutritional value of small birds, often creating stews that incorporated the entire bird, including bones and organs. Vikings became experts at catching and preparing marine creatures that most people would consider inedible or dangerous. They knew how to safely prepare jellyfish, removing the stinging cells while preserving the protein content. They developed techniques for processing sea urchins, extracting the edible portions while avoiding the toxic parts. They even learned to prepare certain types of seaweed-eating fish that were normally considered inedible due to their strong taste. The most remarkable emergency technique was their ability to process and eat various deep-sea creatures that their nets would occasionally bring up. Vikings had specific preparation methods for unusual fish species, knowing which parts were safe to eat and how to neutralize potential toxins. They understood that desperate times called for expanding their definition of edible food, but they did so systematically rather than recklessly. Vikings also developed techniques for maximizing the nutritional value of food scraps and waste products. Bones from previous meals could be boiled repeatedly to extract marrow and create nutritious broths. Fish heads and organs that might normally be discarded were processed into pastes and stews that provided essential nutrients. Even food that had begun to spoil could sometimes be salvaged through careful preparation and cooking. These 8 Viking survival methods represent more than just ancient techniques. They're a masterclass in human adaptability, strategic thinking, and the power of systematic preparation. The Vikings proved that survival isn't just about having supplies, it's about having the knowledge, creativity, and mental toughness to thrive when everything goes wrong. If you have enjoyed raiding the past with us, then go ahead and pillage that like button and subscribe for more interesting journeys into the world of Midgard living.